Shalom and welcome to the Charles L. Feinberg Center for Messianic Jewish Studies here in Brooklyn, New York. My name is Robert Walter. I'm on staff with Chosen People Ministries as the New York Regional Director, and I'm a graduate of the Feinberg program and still involved with the seminary in a number of ways. And we want to thank you all who are joining us in person, of course, and then everyone who's joining us online as well. Welcome to Brooklyn, and we hope you're able to enjoy a bagel while you're here. Now, we are very blessed this morning and really throughout this entire day because we are picking up with another one of our Feinberg Lecture series. And the topic today will be the early church and the Jewish people, the first 3 centuries. And we have a very special guest presenter joining us today who will be bringing us through really these first 3 centuries of history. And I'm sure it's going to bless you. I'm sure it's going to be very intriguing and new information probably, and I'm sure edifying as well. So let me introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Daniel Nessim. He is the son of Jewish parents who also believe in Yeshua, in Jesus. His mother is a survivor of the Holocaust, having been hidden in Berlin throughout the Second World War. His father was from a Jewish family from Baghdad in Cairo. A few years after his arrival in England in the 1950s, Daniel's father became the first in his family to believe in Yeshua. Daniel has thus had a privilege rarely accorded to Jewish believers in Yeshua, having a heritage of faith in his own family. Thus, at the age of 7, Daniel already knew that Yeshua was his Messiah and Lord and made a decision to accept him as his Savior. After the family moved to Vancouver, Canada, where Daniel's father led a mission to the Jewish people, Daniel eventually began a career in the engineering field. Before long, however, he studied for a bachelor's in theology from Northwest Baptist Bible College, and then went to Regent College for a Master of Arts in Christian Studies. It was shortly after this that Daniel joined Chosen People Ministries, working out of Seattle, Washington. After a few years, Daniel and his wife went to England with their son, where they established the United Kingdom branch of Chosen People Ministries. They also planted a Messianic Jewish congregation in the heart of England's Jewish community. Dr. Nessim holds a PhD in theology and religion from the University of Exeter in England, having focused his studies on the life of the earliest believers and their beliefs. He is the co-author of Introducing Your Jewish Friend to Yeshua, and has also written Derech Yeshua, The Way of Salvation, as well as a Messianic Jewish prayer book. Daniel is passionately committed to seeing other Jewish people come to accept the messiahship of Yeshua. He believes that there is a great need to put shoe leather on the fact that Jewish people can believe in Yeshua and still be Jewish. Thus, he maintains his own Jewish lifestyle as a personal commitment while encouraging other Jewish people to accept their Messiah. And I'm sure you'll see throughout today that Daniel is a very skilled communicator who has spoken extensively in Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Israel. And he currently serves among the Jewish people of Washington State and Vancouver, BC, and teaches in the Messianic Jewish movement. So without further ado, let's please greet and welcome Dr. Daniel Nessim.
Bobby. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I think you'll find this to be a very interesting time, at least I hope so, because the time that we're going to look at, the first 3 centuries of the Christian era, or the common era as we call it, is crucial to the development of both Judaism and Christianity. It's a period that both faiths look back on in some ways as a model for what they would like today and would like to see today. Our first three centuries lasts roughly until the Nicene Council took place in today what is called Nikkei, Turkey. It covers a lot of time, 300 years. and covers some vast, shattering changes for both the Jewish people and Christianity. This is a story of theological development driven by social necessity that transformed the early church from one form of being the Jewish people to another, one could say. Our period begins when the church was the Jewish people, in that its members were all Jewish, through a period during which it began and increasingly rejected the Jewish people, to an age where, although few of its members were Jewish, it considered itself to be the rightful Jewish people, the people of Israel. At the beginning of our period, when the church was the Jewish people, all of its members were Jews or proselytes. In this hour, we'll delve into what that meant. So our title for this first lecture is The Essenes, the Apostles, and the Didache. And I carry with me the first volume of the Apostolic Fathers from Loeb, which was my companion, close companion, for many years as I studied the Didache in the UK and in Seattle. We'll ask, what is or was the religion of this earliest church? What were their presuppositions? Can we discern their theological map from their writings and those they drew on? How did they perceive themselves? And how did these earliest believers perceive what we now call the Gentile mission? In our second hour, we will pursue a little bit further the texts and basically written remnants that tell us about this early period, this first 3 centuries. As we do so, we'll cover various authors, and I seem to have lost my paper. Just one sec. Computer went blank on me. There we go. We'll look at various authors and see the development of thought that they have within themselves, but also the development that they are displaying that existed in the early church at that period. We will particularly look at texts that reflect on the peoplehood of the Jews and their relationship to the early church. In the third hour, we will once again look a little bit at the Essenes, but this time we will look at them in relationship to the early church as a whole and to its social, cultural context. The aim of this inquiry is to help to redefine and nuance the quest for the supposedly undefiled Christian Judaism, a mythical Christian Judaism that today, even in the Messianic world, is sometimes looked upon as a prototype. We're going to look at not only this, but also nascent Christianity, which is one of the terms we used to talk about Christianity before it was an ism, and frankly, before Judaism was an ism. We're going to make some pertinent observations regarding the so-called parting of the ways. And we also want to observe how in some respects, maybe most respects, at that time, the ways never parted. Further, in an age that has seen the Jewish reclamation of Jesus, that is our age now, we've seen the new perspective on Paul, which is superseded in some areas by the Paul within Judaism endeavors, and a beginning of a Jewish reclamation of Christian literature. We're going to see that and evaluate it. So our period begins in a day that is dominated by the temple in Jerusalem. It's dominated in those early days, as we read in the book of Acts, and as we see recorded later on, by the teaching of the apostles. But this is also a day when, paradoxically, Israel has somewhat of a monarchy in place. It continues in an era in which scholars struggle to determine the boundary lines between Judaism and Christianity. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that Jews at this time did not define themselves as a religion. The term Judaism, while it does occur here and there, was not common. The Jewish people did not define themselves as a religious group, but more as a people who had a certain covenant relationship with God. As Daniel Boyarin put it in his simply in his book, The Jewish Gospels, actually there was no Judaism at all, neither was there Christianity. In fact, the very idea of religion in the modern sense, with all of its isms, was foreign to that day. This leads Matt Jackson McCabe, a favorite author of mine, to suggest that, in a sense, everything before the 4th century was Judeo-Christianity. Not Jewish, not Christian, but in the so-called Christian world, Judeo-Christianity. This isn't to say that everything before the 4th century was not Christian or was not Jewish, but among believers in Jesus, to a large degree, the two were somewhat merged. Then as now, even answering the question, who is a Jew, has proven elusive. While intermarriage was rare, it seems, in that day, nevertheless, today, it was difficult sometimes to define who was a Jew. Levels of observance varied tremendously. So how do we distinguish between the early church and the Jewish people? Edwin Broadhead, in his book Jewish Ways of Following Jesus, provides a possible way out of the impasse, and one that can help us determine the polarities of this discussion. It revolves around those who were presumably in between the church and the synagogue. Broadhead suggests that in terms of Jewish Christianity, or its equally problematic but somewhat preferable Christian Judaism, it is best to consider it a form of meta-language used in a technical sense. We can't really say what is Jewish Christianity or Christian Judaism because the border lines between them were so blurred and varied. There is an absence of any definable homogeneous group or consistent ideology. In terms of Christianity, however, Jewish Christianity can actually be defined by exclusion. As Broadhead suggests, excluded from this definition of Jewish Christianity would be all conceptions of an Israel replaced by or superseded by Christianity, all systems that abrogate or replace the law, all allegorizing or spiritualizing interpretations of the law, and all Christological paradigms that call into question the basic integrity of monotheism. These represent a disruption rather than a continuation of Israel's heritage. What I'm suggesting is that if we define Jewish Christianity of the day in line with Broadbent's proposal, we will also have a useful yardstick by which to define the Jewish people in contradistinction to the church. Put in positive terms, then, for our purposes, the Jewish people are those characterized by a conscious identity of being the people of Israel, a people who have a covenantal relationship with God manifest in the law, fidelity as well to the one God and God alone. This distinction will be manifest as we look at the literary milieu of the New Testament in the era when the early church was the Jewish people. It's reasonable to suppose that the apostles and those around them did not know that they were writing what would later be called the New Testament. It goes without saying in our context today that they did not expect that they were founding a new religion, simply that they were proclaiming the apex of God's plan for Israel and the world in Israel's Messiah, Yeshua. These presuppositions place their writings within the Jewish world. As a result, it behooves us to survey their literary world, for in treating the early church and the Jewish people, our records for this first period are almost exclusively literary. There are some archaeological remains, but often they are disputable. What were the writings that they were familiar with? Were they influenced by the content of these writings and the forms that they were written in? We're asking, what were the Jews reading in the apostles' day? We have numerous categories of material, categories which we may be superimposing from our era onto theirs. The first is closest to the Jerusalem Jewish world and comprises the Dead Sea Library. It, in addition, overlaps with what we call the Apocrypha, which also, to some degree, you could say overlaps with what we call the Pseudepigrapha. And, of course, there was the Hebrew Bible itself. Jews of the day also read writings from Egypt and from Syria. In addition, there were writings by Philo of Alexandria, who was in Egypt and forms a class of its own. And then thirdly, another completely different realm of writing that some would have been familiar with, but certainly not the majority, would have been the writings of the Gentile world, which not only included Greek literature, but also Roman writers such as Cicero and Varro. These writings would have been known by many. While literacy was low by modern standards, this did not preclude some knowledge of their contents by the unlettered. The first place in our literature that we see any relationship between the early church and the Jewish people is in the New Testament itself. The book of Romans is famous itself for Paul's frequent pivots from addressing Jews and Gentiles in the Church of Rome. However, both Jewish and Gentile, these were together the early church. And just as the Jewish readers of the epistle were members of the church, so they were also members of the Jewish people. In order to have a constructive discussion then, as we consider the Jewish people and the church in the first 3 centuries, we do need to continue drawing some sort of distinction between Jew and Gentile. These are certainly distinctions that are affirmed in the New Testament and in Romans, for example, where Paul asserts his identity as an Israelite. He speaks to the Gentiles as the other, with phrases such as, "Now I am speaking to you, Gentiles," and refers to their ongoing relationship with God in chapter 11, asserting that they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. This then is the platform that we're laying for our exploration of the early church and the Jewish people. The awareness of peoplehood among the Jewish people and an awareness of their enduring relationship with the God of Israel. In the first century, one cannot properly distinguish between the church and the Jewish people in large degree because in the very early years, the church is the Jewish people, and the challenge of the day at that time, as we know well, was how to integrate the Gentiles into that ecclesia. Any reader of the Dead Sea Scrolls will see in short order that they demonstrate tremendous variety. Some would say that they cannot be the writings of one sect alone, and that has a lot of merit to it. The writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls include the Damascus document, another writing we call the Serek HaYachad, previously known as the Manual of Discipline or Community Rule, the Book of Jubilees, many sectarian writings, books, a book on the temple called the Temple Scroll that exists in multiple copies, commentaries, legal texts, other texts that are categorized as rewritten Torah, and the books of Enoch and more. Norman Golb has argued extensively that the scrolls are obviously not the work of one group, noting that just about every single scroll is written in a different hand. And so he theorizes that possibly they were a temple library or a library from somewhere in Jerusalem, spirited away from Jerusalem for safekeeping before the first Jewish revolt. And such things need to be considered. And we should remember, of course, that we're in the period very shortly after the academies of Hillel and Shammai, and certainly there were significant libraries, we assume, in Jerusalem, in part because of that. With all that said, it is still evident from Josephus and Pliny that there was such a thing as an Essene sect, and that many of their distinctives are indeed reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the most significant scrolls is 1QS, found in the first cave, as the letter or number 1 signifies, the Serek HaYachad, which I mentioned a minute ago. The Serek speaks of its community with 3 different types of members. There are those in Aaron who volunteer for holiness, the priests. There are those in Israel who belong to truth, that is, the rest of the Israelites, and interestingly, the Levites are skipped over in this division. And thirdly, there are those who are Gentile proselytes who join them in community. So this is reminiscent of the triple denomination of Torah readers in the synagogue, those who are of the priests, Levites, and all of Israel, but it is different, and significantly so, particularly because they include Gentiles. Membership in this Yahad, as the community called itself, the community, is characterized by immersion. It's not immersion to signify conversion, because most of its members were Israelites, but it is immersion to signify not only ritual purity, but also purity of heart. The efficacy of this immersion is directly tied to teshuvah, repentance from evil. And the word shuv is frequently used. For those wicked people who refrain from entering the Yahad, we are told ceremonies of atonement cannot restore their innocence, neither cultic waters their purities. He or they cannot be sanctified by baptism in oceans and rivers, nor purified by mere ritual bathing. The Yahad also had an instructor who was to enlighten and teach all the sons of light about the character and fate of humankind. So hopefully you're beginning to draw connections between the Yahad and the early believers in Jerusalem. More to the point that we'll get to, the Serach did not propose or presuppose that all of its members lived in its major communities. The major community that we know of most clearly is that of Qumran. However, there was also Jerusalem. Its members might dwell, according to this document, in diverse locations, but were to eat, pray, and deliberate communally. Some of these groups might be quite small, and so they are instructed that whenever 10 men belonging to the party of the Yahad are gathered, a priest must also be present. The men shall sit before the priest by rank, and in that manner their opinions will be sought on any matter. There's also an aspirational aspect to the Serach, like the New Testament. It looks forward to the day when there are men who preserve faith, emunah, in the land, with self-control and a broken spirit, atoning for sin by working justice and suffering affliction. When such men come to be in Israel, the Serach instructs that they are to go into the wilderness to prepare the truth, as it is written, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." This means expounding of the law decreed by God through Moses for obedience, end quote. Is it any wonder that James Charlesworth theorized that John the Baptist had a close connection to the Essenes? And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit more about his interesting paper later on. The Serach has no introduction to speak of. A lot of these texts don't. They delve right in. It is simply introduced, however, repeatedly and more or less throughout as a text belonging to the instructor. So here's this scroll belonging to the instructor. It is for him, and he is going to deliver its instructions to the people, and he's going to govern according to its instructions, and also himself live according to its instructions. It instructs how people should be initiated into the covenant of the community, and it also gives rules for membership. A lot of rules. Toward the end of the third column, the paths of light are contrasted with the paths of darkness, with the God of Israel being the one who created the spirits of light and darkness. The following columns describe the life of the initiate in the community, both in terms of heart attitudes, rules for gatherings, and food laws. Following this, there are rules that are set forth regarding community organization and discipline of errant members. Rules for the instructor and a significant messianic bent appear then in the 9th column, which we're getting close to the end, which looks forward to the day when the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel come to Israel, or the Yahad. Finally, the 10th and 11th columns conclude with a prayer to be delivered by the instructor, and these prayers have an increasingly soteriological bent. Thus he says, "As for me, if I stumble, God's loving kindness forever shall save me. By his loving kindness shall he provide my justification. By his righteousness shall he cleanse me of human defilement and the sin of human kindness." So, while I think we could probably see some similarities in thought to some of the things that we see in the New Testament, we can also see some shades of difference. But I'd like to suggest, and I have to say I'm biased because it was the subject of years of work, that I am intrigued by the literary similarities between the Serach and the Didache. which was a first century instructional manual from the apostles for the Gentiles. It has somewhat the same format. It begins with the personal, with how people are to be inducted into the community. It continues into rules and principles by which the community might be governed, and it concludes with maybe not so much a soteriological, but an eschatological epilogue. Its introduction, as represented by the incipit title, and the incipit title is the title that is in the text itself, the first lines of the text, is quite likely original to the text. There's really no good reason for thinking that it is not, other than that it provides such a good introduction to the text. It identifies the teaching as that of the apostles, while not claiming that it is authored by the apostles themselves. This is somewhat after the fashion of the Serach, which is written for the instructor, but not by the instructor. But obviously, an instructor has composed the book. Just as the Serach broaches the subject of the divergent paths of light and darkness, early on in its column 3, so very early on, the Didache broaches the subject of two ways, one of life and one of death. Both texts stress that there is a huge, stark difference between these two ways. While the Didache says bluntly the difference is great between the two ways, the Serach informs the instructor that God loves one spirit, the spirit of life, but abhors the other, hating its every impulse for all time. And so the general course proceeds. The Serach describing the rules by which one should live in the community, quite strict rules, and the Didache providing instruction that is somewhat halachic in flavor. In the Didache, it's a book of 16 chapters, versified or put into verse and chapter by a man called Philotheus Bryennios, who discovered the manuscript in 1873 in Jerusalem and published it in 1883. He discovered it in the library of the monastery where he lived or worked, in the Jerusalem monastery of the Most Holy Sepulchre in Constantinople, which we know today as Istanbul. He divided it up so that the first 6 chapters comprise what we call the two ways section of the Didache. They are a detailed catalog of acceptable and unacceptable behavior, particularly geared towards Gentiles who might not know typically Jewish Torah-aware, we could say, Torah-aware understanding of what is acceptable. Interestingly, both documents end this section with comments regarding the food laws. The Serach talks about pure food at the end, and the Didache concludes with the instruction, but concerning food, bear what you are able, but particularly abstain from that which is offered to idols, for that is service to dead gods. And you might detect a slight Pauline bent in that statement. What follows is less clear, but there is still a similarity between the two documents. Where, following the discussion of food, the Serach proceeds to discuss communal rules, the Didache proceeds to discuss immersion, which is a communal affair. When someone is immersed, at least the person who is immersing that person, the immersee, is to fast, but preferably the whole community, everyone who knows them. Prayer is continued, and blessing, and here we have a rendition of the Lord's Prayer. And then there are blessings before and after communal meals, a form of Birkat Hamazon. And while the word Eucharist is used, thanksgiving is used of this section, and therefore many commentators take it to be a reference to the Eucharist. That does not come later until chapter 14. This is actually the Birkat Hamazon, the Messianic version, you could say. The Didache then proceeds to more rules by which the community might be managed in terms of leadership and the reception of traveling teachers and prophets. It then proceeds, finally, as I mentioned in Didache 14, to discuss the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, the election of community leaders, and then its final chapter, its eschatological chapter, is very much after the pattern of Matthew 24. The similarity is that although the order is somewhat different between the Didache and the Sirach, nevertheless they cover the same types of materials in the general order, that in the same general order. So we have to ask, as many have before, was there any relationship, and if so, what was it, between the early church and the Essenes? Did the Sirach have an influence on the formation of the Didache? The Didache is obviously a patchwork of various documents. Anyone reading it can see that quickly, and certainly it's been the subject of much study and dissection. But we consider it to have been redacted by a person that we might call the Didachist. He is the final editor, the final person who put the final touches on what was obviously a developing theme of instruction. He is in the early church. He is the one who assembled these documents. So then we can ask, did this Sirach play a role in how he selected and organized his material? So now that we've talked a little bit about the Sirach, I would like to go on a little bit more and talk about the Didache and the Gentiles. Its short title, which is, people call it the Inscriptio, it's the title that would have been written on the outside of a scroll, so that in an ancient library where you would have scrolls that were without spindles, rolled up, tied with a string and stuck in cubicles that or in the wall like pigeonholes, you would be able to tell what was in the scroll by this writing, the Inscriptio, on the outside. That's what forms the title for the book today, The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. This Didache is our best and nearly only source on the relationship between the Jewish people and the church in the very early years of the church outside the New Testament. Increasingly, scholars are dating it to sometime, some have said as early as the 40s, but that's highly unlikely, but sometime between 60 and 100 CE. Previously, years ago, people used to date it as being in the 3rd century, but the Dead Sea Scrolls have changed all of that. At this point, I hope I haven't lost it again. Okay. At this point, we're going to see that the writer is clearly writing from within the Jewish literary world. And the first issue between the Didachists and the Gentiles was the issue of their relationship to God should they become part of the ecclesia. What are we going to do with these Gentile converts in communities that are springing up around the region of Syria and elsewhere? Interestingly, we can see right away in the very title that we've mentioned, in the title that is in the text, we can see that there is an understanding of a Jewish-Gentile distinction, because this is a teaching that is to the Gentiles. This is the teaching for the nations. This distinction carries through into the very first verse following, where we read that first, the first command is to love the God who made you, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. We might ask, where does this interesting phrase, love the God who made you, come from? And it is simply because the author understands that this is not the God who delivered Israel from Egypt, as is the original context of the saying, but for all humanity, he is the God who made us all. So, while the language seems to echo the Hebrew Bible, it also makes a distinction. For the Israelite, the Shema is preceded by reference to the Lord, the God of your fathers, and followed by reference to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And it goes without saying that for Gentile recipients of the Didache, the gods of their fathers were the gods of the heathen, and their fathers were not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so they have been specifically addressed in terms that apply to them and apply to all of us as human beings. And so the Didache takes everything that is here and applies it to human life, and applies it to the life of the believer. He unites us and says, this is the teaching that relates to these matters. Bless those who curse you, pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. He tells the Didache Christians, as we might call them, do the Gentiles not do this as well? And again, now this is curious language, because he's just said he's writing to the Gentiles, and then he tells the Gentiles, this is the way that you ought to live. You ought to love those who love you. And he said, but why is it so great to love those who love you? Do the Gentiles not do this as well? But you should love those who hate you. In other words, he is now uniting them under the instruction of Yeshua the Messiah. And so there is a sense in which the Gentiles are Gentiles, but already we're beginning to see a little bit of a blurring of the boundaries, because the Gentiles who have come to faith are also in some ways different from other Gentiles. In the original context of the Master's saying, this is Toby Janicki, a friend of ours. In the original context of the Master's saying, he comments, Yeshua used the term Gentiles in antithesis to his Jewish disciples. In the same way, when the word appears in the context of Didache 1 and 3, it must be understood to refer to idolaters who have not yet accepted the God of Israel. The in and the out are different. There are people who are in the community, and there are those who are without. This is, of course, in line with the way the word is used in the New Testament. And that in itself is a bigger discussion. But it does alert us to the fact that even in the earliest days, there was some differentiation going on between Gentiles who were pagans and Gentiles who had come to God, without applying the term proselyte to them. Following these initial commands, the Didache proceeds to lay out the obligations of the Gentile disciple. These obligations are laid out in a strikingly Torah-like fashion. I write in my dissertation, which has been published by Wipf and Stock, that the Didachist gives the Didache, or his teaching here, all the authority of the Torah. He exalts the teacher in the same way as was done in Second Temple Judaism. It was not only the Essenes who demanded that people obey their instructor and look forward to the day of the teacher of righteousness. These were the days following the Zugot, or pair of teachers, the last of whom were Hillel and Shammai, whom we mentioned. And it was the day dawning the era of the Tanaim, whose teachings, based on those of the Zugot, would in turn become the basis for the Mishnah. While rabbinic authority had not yet developed as it would to those who followed the teachings of Second Temple Judaism and their teachers were indeed authoritative, and the Didache took that authority to itself. And we see this level of authority very much in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where so often the authority of the teacher is absolute and not to be questioned. In addition to this, the Didache asserts that the authority of the Lord himself, because it says this is the teaching of the Lord through the 12 apostles. It uses what we call the Sectio Evangelica or Evangelica. This is a section where verses are used that reflect very closely, in some ways, the Sermon of the Mount, particularly in verses 3 to 5. And the Didache again reflects the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 16. Again, in that text, asserting the authority of the Lord. But perhaps that is all just a preface to the authority that the Didache is exerting upon or taking upon itself for its readers, as in Didache chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5, we have 3 lists of commands for the Gentile. Each list is slightly different, but covers the same ground. And each of these 3 lists argues on the basis of the commands of the second table of the law. This is something that was initially noted by a scholar in South Africa, Jonathan Draper, and helped me to form my own arguments concerning the Didache. In each list, all 5 of these commands are mentioned. In each list, the commands concerning murder, adultery, and theft are reproduced also in the very same order as they occur in the Hebrew text, but with other commands in between them. And this varies depending on the list, but what you get is the sense that what is being developed is a halacha for the Gentile, basically taking the second table of the Torah and applying it to them in their context. And so, to me, there is no doubt that the Didache intended to apply the Torah to its Gentile recipients. You might be asking yourself, what about the first table of the Torah then? What was the Didache doing with that? Certainly, we've been told, love the God who made you, and we're reminded of the beginning of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, where Israel is told, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. We have it behind us, Ani Adonai, Anochi Adonai. And we are told that he only should be worshipped. But from then on, the commands that are given in that first table are basically given short shrift. It's interesting because this omission seems to be quite intentional. While it's clear that all of us, all of humanity, should worship the Lord our God, it seems that the Didache was referring specifically to what was applicable to the Gentile convert and leaving the rest. God was the one, for example, who said to the children of Israel, you shall not take the Lord your God in vain. There is some allusion to this command in the Didache, but specifically, the fourth and fifth commands are not introduced to the Didachean believer. For example, the command to keep the Sabbath day is commanded in Exodus 20 on the basis of God's creation on the seventh day. So one might think that it is a command for all people. However, Deuteronomy chapter 5 clarifies and gives an entirely different or additional rationale, that of the Exodus from Egypt. This serves to clarify that the reason for the day of rest is based in Israel's redemption, and the reason for it being on the seventh day of the week is because that was God's day of rest. Despite Philo's general advocacy of the Sabbath to all humanity, for many Jews of the first century, the Sabbath was something specific to Israel. Jubilees chapter 2 is representative of this in regard to the Sabbath, reading, the Creator of all blessed it, but he did not sanctify any people or nations to keep the Sabbath thereon, with the sole exception of Israel. He granted to them alone that they might eat and drink and keep the Sabbath thereon upon the earth. And this interpretation is corroborated, or probably originates from Exodus chapter 31, where we read, and the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. And those who are familiar with the Sabbath liturgy know that this is reproduced. Ot hi le'olam. This is a sign forever between God and Israel. This commandment, therefore, is specifically associated with Israel, and therefore is not reproduced in the Didache for the Gentile believer. Then, relevantly, the fifth command to honor one's father and mother is particularly striking. Connected with a promise, Exodus 20 reads, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Here, whether long life is for the individual or nation, the point is that it is connected to life in the land given by God. And so the Didache, while it nowhere gives a hint of disrespect for parents, nevertheless omits this command. So it does seem, although it is not conclusive, it seems that the Didache is specifically applying the second table of the Decalogue to all humanity, but understands the first table as largely, specifically connected to the people of Israel. This is Important now when we return to the prohibition of idolatry. The Didache does include this command. This command has universal applicability. It is specific. It is clear. It is comparable to the description of the path of the black one and the path of eternal death in a related text, the book of Barnabas 20, verse 1, which begins with idolatry at the head of its list of those things that destroy people's souls. As in the Didache, Barnabas omits the other commands of the first table of the Torah, but unlike the Didache, there is no tripartite repetition of the second table. It is possible that Barnabas is reflecting the division between the universal and particular commands of the tables, but without the evidence of this stress on the Decalogue and the second table, there's little material present on which to draw a conclusion. So coming to the end of this first discussion on the Didache, it's evident that in the first century, at least in terms of the Didache, which was written sometime shortly after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, there are some clear observations which we can make about the early church and the Jewish people. We began by noting that in this time period, it is not so easy to distinguish between the two. Certainly, any attempt to distinguish between Judaism and Christianity is an anachronism for that day, as it neither truly existed at this time, and not only did the distinction not truly exist, but neither did Judaism or Christianity in many ways, except perhaps in nascent form. We further noted that one can't properly speak of the church and Jewish people because as a whole, the Jewish people, in terms of a relationship, because as a whole, the Jewish people were the church at that time, struggling, as the Didache shows, and doing quite well, in incorporating Gentile members into their community. These Gentiles, however, are not considered Jews. They were not expected to keep the Torah in terms of those precepts connected to the Jewish people, the ones in the first table of the two tablets of the law. Nevertheless, in our discussion, we've seen some glimmers of what you might call identity formation, as in the New Testament, in that the Gentiles of the church are sometimes referred to as other than just pagan Gentiles from which they have come, but are distinct in some ways from them.